Get there. So yesterday we were in port, and today is what? A day at sea. Ah, thank you. Yes. And this morning I want to talk to you about our visit tomorrow to Devil's Island, which I actually consider to be one of the most interesting places we're going to be visiting. It's a fascinating, off-the-beaten-path destination for cruise ships. I promise that there's no Diamonds International. Applause. No ship tours, no taxi cabs, just a very interesting historical landmark. And I know after our lecture today that you'll find it even more interesting if you know some of the story. Although it is in the Caribbean, barely, this island off South America is part of French Guiana, which is an overseas region of France. It's the largest overseas region, and as such, it is inside the European Union. The official currency is the euro, as it is on Devil's Island. Unlike St. Lucia, Martinique, it was not one of France's better properties in the region, and it still isn't, in my opinion. It has a population of 221,000 people, very heavily dependent on France, and even so, it has an unemployment rate that runs about 20-25%. Its biggest industry, something you might not expect here, and I'll talk about this near the end, is the European Space Center, which there is actually, we'll talk about as it relates to this island. French Guiana was first visited by Columbus in 1498, but it was really only settled by the French in the 17th century. And then it ping-ponged, like some of these islands did, back and forth between French, Dutch, and British. You never knew which flag to run up in the morning. But in the Peace of Paris in 1763, that ended the French and Indian War, and France agreed to give up its North American territory in the States, but it hung on to islands in the Caribbean and Guyana. So to secure their South American territory, Louis XV sent 12,000 settlers to French Guiana to colonize. But the effort was a complete disaster. After a year and a half in what was called the living hell of Guyana, only a few hundred settlers managed to survive. Those settlers fled to 3 small islands offshore that were originally called the Triangle Islands. Because it was their key to survival, they called them the Salvation Islands, which is what they're called today. And because it had saved them from the horrors they felt of the jungles of Guyana. The settlers eventually were picked up, went home to France with horror stories about Guyana. So obviously their reports didn't encourage folks to want to move to Guyana to colonize it. So the French solution was Napoleon III established a penal colony in Guyana. Now some of you from Australia, something similar happened there. When we get down around the southern tip of South America, both Argentina and Peru established penal colonies down there, places like Ushuaia and stuff, to force colonization of those areas. So that's what happened here in Guyana. There were 4 camps on the mainland, and then 1 on each of the Salvation Islands. The colony continued to be used by France as a prison until 1946. The penal colony was used to force settlement of Guyana. Convicts were forced to stay after their release for a time equal to their sentence. So if your sentence was 6 years, you had to stay another 6 years after that. If your sentence was 8 years or more, you were to stay for life. And since there was no transportation furnished to get back to France, when you were sent to French Guiana, really, for all practical purposes, you were sentenced there for life. In 1855, France accelerated the process by sending repeat offenders for very minor crimes, shoplifting, just very minor stuff, were sent there as prisoners. The primary camps were on the mainland, and the most famous, most notorious, and also the smallest was the one on Devil's Island. Devil's Island was used only for violent and political prisoners. Usually there were only about 4 to 6 inmates on Devil's Island itself, and the maximum ever there was 12. But it was part of this whole system. Now there are 2 theories as to how the name Devil's Island came about. The first is that because of the treacherous currents, which really helped to make escape almost impossible, and which, unfortunately, we still must contend with at times when we are calling at Devil's Island. Weather permitting, we are going to stop and get off the ship, but it's a tricky operation there. The second is that there were very large, noisy blackbirds that inhabited the island, and they were locally called Devil's Birds. So that's how it got the name Devil's Island. The most famous prisoner ever here was Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was a young French military officer. He showed really great promise. He graduated at the head of his class at the War College. But his commanding general gave Dreyfus poor marks, saying that, quote, Jews were not desired in the army. Dreyfus protested, but to no avail. But he did manage to ruffle establishment feathers. In 1894, he was accused of treason. He was convicted in a secret court-martial, stripped of his rank, and sentenced to life in prison and sent to Devil's Island. And the only really building that remains on Devil's Island proper is the one in the picture here, this little hut. When the people were sent to Devil's Island, pretty much they were sent there and left there. That was it. They'd get food by fishing or trying to grow stuff. Whatever clothes they had, they'd make them until they basically wore out completely and lived in rags. And there were very few people actually lived on Devil's Island. And the only thing that still remains is that house, which is called Dreyfus's house. Whether he actually is the one who built that or not, I'm not sure that that has been proven, but it is supposedly the house of Dreyfus. Well, what happened is 10 years later, Dreyfus was exonerated of what were trumped-up charges against him. He was given the rank of major and eventually was awarded the French Legion of Honor medal. The other very famous prisoner was Clement Duval. Duval was a noted French anarchist who was sent to Devil's Island and sentenced to death. Now, what does an anarchist believe? Well, this is what he said. Theft exists only through the exploitation of man by man. When society refuses you the right to exist, you must take it. The policeman arrested me in the name of the law. I struck him in the name of liberty. So that's not a very popular opinion in many countries. Duval's sentence, he was sentenced to death, sent to Devil's Island. And yes, they did have a guillotine here. There's nothing new about lopping off heads. They've been doing it for a long time. And they did use it, but Duval's sentence was later commuted, and he ends up in all places in New York City. Maybe that's a popular idea, his idea in New York City, who knows. But he ended up in New York City, where he died in 1935, but that is Clement Duval, a very noted anarchist. Now, Devil's Island has been very popular with movie makers. The first film starring Boris Karloff was released in 1939. If you can imagine a comedy about Devil's Island, We're No Angels with Humphrey Bogart was a 1955 comedy about 3 escapees, guys that escaped from Devil's Island, went home to spend Christmas with their families, and decided that life on Devil's Island was a hell of a lot better, escaped their families and went back to Devil's Island, deciding that Christmas in prison is better than time with your family. The most famous of these is Papillon, which was released in 1973, starring Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. And we are going to show it here this afternoon. And you really should come and see it. It's a movie that's loosely, and I emphasize loosely, based on Devil's Island. Don't take it as historically accurate throughout, but it does give you an idea, and a good idea, of what life was like here. And two fantastic actors, and Dustin Hoffman is just fantastic in this. Very young Dustin Hoffman, but it really is, it's a great movie, and we're going to show it this afternoon. The book, Papillon, was written by Henri Charry, and it really was a combination of his own experience in the Guiana prison camps and tales that he heard from others. It was published in 1970, became an instant bestseller, sold over 1.5 million copies in France the first year, causing the French government minister to attribute moral decline in France to miniskirts and the book Papillon. So as a 25-year-old, Charry was convicted of the murder of a pimp. Now, he always denied that charge, but he was sent to the prison camp at Saint-Laurent. Like many of the prisoners, he lived to escape. He ends up escaping several times, being recaptured, and in 1944, he finally escapes on a bag of coconuts and ends up in Venezuela, where he's arrested and imprisoned for a year. Now, there's a controversy as to how much of the book is actually tales of others, since Papillon was really a nickname from a butterfly tattoo, and the butterfly tattoos were very popular, self-done, because some of the guys collected, like you'll see this in the movie, tried to make money by collecting the blue morpho butterflies, which, if you're lucky, you'll still see some on the island. And so there was this controversy. Was it really his? Was it all other people's stories? In 2005, a guy by the name of Charles Brunier, who was 104 years old at the time, claimed that he, in fact, was Papillon in the book. He, in fact, did have a butterfly tattoo and had been on Devil's Island at the same time. So nobody really knows for sure. Now, there are 3 books about this, and really, Papillon, I think, is not, although it's the most popular of the books, it's not the best one. The best one, in my opinion, is Dry Guillotine. It was published in 1938. It was the earliest and most powerful book about the Guiana prison colony. It was written by a guy, Rene Belbenoit. He wrote the book while he was in prison in an attempt to correct the abuses that he felt were going on, and then smuggled it out on one of his escape attempts. While he was in prison, Belbenoit, like many of the prisoners, had to earn money to survive. And like many of the prisoners, he repeatedly tries to escape. He's recaptured. He writes, "For always existence in the prison colony holds up 2 alternatives, escape or die." So the prisoners would save up whatever money they could make for use when they escaped, and respecting the fact that there is no honor among thieves, and without access to a personal room safe, the inmates created their own in the form of homemade rectal suppositories. And these things, called in the book a plan, figure prominently in the story of his escape attempts. And if you have difficulty imagining this, here's a picture of the official CIA-issued rectal suppository. Now you know why James Bond walked around so funny. So that's a big part of this story. Now, what happens, Belbenoit meets, while he's in prison, he meets a French writer, Blair Niles, and he buys some of the stories about the penal colonies, and those stories end up being published in a newspaper in France. 1931, writings come to the attention of the new reformist governor of French Guiana, who ends up being reappointed, but before he leaves office, he gives Belbenoit 1 year permit to leave the penal colony. Belbenoit goes to Panama and spends most of this 1 year working in the Panama Canal zone as a gardener. Now, one of the neat things about doing a trip that's 64 days, same thing happens on the world cruise, these longer cruises, is that you begin to see connections between the places that we're visiting. Penal Colony in French Guiana, we'll get to talk about penal colonies at the southern tip of South America for the same purpose, to colonize. We're going to go through the Panama Canal. Here's Belbenoit going through the Panama, or working in the Panama Canal Zone. So he works there as a gardener. He decides to go back to France to argue his case before the one-year permit expires. But when he enters France, he is arrested, sent back to the penal colony for the crime of returning to France. He's sent back to the island of Royal, and he's put in solitary confinement for 1 year. Of his own prison experience, Belbenoit writes, quote, "Any other civilized nation would have given them a chance to remake their lives instead of sending them to a death in prison. Some of them committed a first felony in excess of folly, caught in a cycle of circumstances, as so often happens in life, and are in no sense criminals. They are men who have energy, moral fiber, and self-respect, and are now, who lost in the gamble for liberty with all the odds against them, and are now locked up like criminals in close quarters with assassins, thieves, and perverts." Now, we look with horror on this stuff. And the more you know about what went on in the French penal colony, the more horrible it gets. But before we judge France too harshly, those of us, at least from the US, might look at our own prison system. US America has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with 5% of the world's population and 25% of all the world's prisoners. That's incredible. Nearly 2.5 million US Americans are in prison. Over 65 million people, or 20% of the country, have criminal records. Nearly 40% of our country's prisons are Afro-Americans, who only make up 13% of the general population. President Obama, who became the first US president in history to visit a federal prison while in office, said last year, "These are young people who made mistakes that aren't that different from the mistakes I made and the mistakes that a lot of you guys make. The difference is that they did not have the kind of support structure, the second chances, the resources that would allow them to survive those mistakes." This is the young Barack Obama smoking a joint. This is the president. So, hopefully, eventually we're going to start to do something about this. So in 1938, Belbenoit manages to stow away on a ship for Los Angeles. And a year later, Dry Guillotine is published. It goes through 14 printings in 1 year, and that attracts the attention of US immigration. They have him deported, but ever persistent, he returns to the US. He's arrested and serves 15 months. Now, it's not clear, but somehow he manages to get a US passport, moves to Lucerne Valley, California. He opens a little general store. And in 1951, a new book, Hell on Trial, attracts the attention of US immigration authorities, and they come knocking again. But in the meantime, he had become a consultant for Warner Brothers, had some important studio contacts, and so becomes an official US citizen in 1957, and he died in the US 2 years later. Fascinating, fascinating story. So, like I say, if you only know Papillon, you've really missed the most interesting stuff about Devil's Island. One of the most interesting, I think, is Francis Lagrange's autobiography, Flag on Devil's Island, that was published in 1961. This is a tough book to get a hold of, but if you ever see it, grab it. Lagrange was sentenced. We had when we moved to Panama, my wife's big concern was, where are we going to get books? And it turned out in the little town next door, there was a retired American guy who had a bookstore, and he had all these used books, books and books, books. If you're interested, you can buy that operation. He died, and his heirs are desperate to sell it for $20,000. I mean, what good is a used paperback bookstore now? But anyhow, I went in, and I was looking for this book, and he said, I think we have it someplace. And he got it, pulled it out, and I think I paid $3 for it. And the next time I was in there, he said, Richard, are you interested in selling that book back? And I said, no, it's very valuable. I'm really enjoying it and use it a lot. And he said, well, I made a mistake. He said, it's really being sold on Amazon for $70, this paperback book. He died. He never got the book back, but I still have it. But anyhow, Lagrange was sentenced for 20 years for art forgery and currency counterfeiting. After several escape attempts, he's assigned to solitary confinement on the mainland prison of Saint Laurent. And here's where this really gets interesting. He bribed a guard to smuggle in canvas, paintbrushes, and small cans of house paints. And so we have these marvelous paintings by him of what life was actually like in the prison system. This is a painting inside the prison ship during the crossing. And I think there's an interesting scene about this whole thing in the movie, as I remember. So that's inside the prison camp. They were locked up, guards watching them. This is landing at the penal colony of Saint Laurent. This is inside the prison camp. Now, what happened, this was one of the better prisons, and dry guillotine is written about the early days. In the dry guillotine days, they didn't have any clothing, they weren't given anything. As time went on, the conditions got a little bit better, but you still kind of were on your own. You had to kind of grow your food or something. I mean, it was not like you had 3 squares a day. There's a picture here building the Camp of Death, building a road near Saint Laurent. I think they got one half of a loaf of bread, a baguette, one half a day. That's what they got to eat. Whatever else they got to eat, they had to grow, fish, whatever. So these are fantastic, fantastic pictures. This is life inside the barracks after the camps closed. This guy, Lagrange, like many of the prisoners, the camps closed, they were stuck there. So when the camps closed, he would take some of these paintings and just to get food, would sell them at a restaurant in Cayenne to get in exchange for food. And it so happened that there was a journalist from the US who happened to be there, saw these pictures just tacked up on the wall, and started collecting them, and then went and found him, Lagrange, and started buying his paintings. And incredibly, they've all ended up in a museum in the Midwest in the US. You can go online and you can see them all. It's really an incredible thing. So this is what it was like in the prison barracks at night. This is a well-organized escape attempt. They're now at the University of Missouri, and they're displayed in an online digital library. These are the solitary confinement cells. Really not much better, really, than those at California's Pelican Bay prison, where I have been, but not a lot better. This is a tribunal issuing a death sentence, and yes, being French, of course, there was a guillotine. Here we see a prisoner being led to his execution. When you visit Devil's Island, you will see the cemetery, which really was used only for guards and their families and their pets, their dogs and stuff. Prisoners, when they died, were loaded into a lorry, taken down, and dumped into the ocean because there were lots of sharks swimming there. It got rid of the prisoners' bodies, but it also fed the sharks, kept the sharks there, which was a definite thing to discourage people to try and swim to freedom. When you go to Devil's Island, and I'll show you in a minute, there's a little swimming area it goes back to the time of the camps, where they had put out rocks so that they could swim there. It's not a place with a beach or anything, but they could swim there, and the rocks would hopefully keep the sharks from coming into the swimming area. So fascinating, fascinating stuff. They had a leper colony. The lepers were kept in a segregated colony, no guards. They were visited once a month by a medical officer, nurse type person, who then came along with a monthly load of supplies that they dropped off, and then the boat left and they were on their own to do whatever. This is a dramatic picture of an escape attempt at sea. And when the convicts were freed, they really had nothing but their own lives. They were free to try and eke out an existence in town. Returning to France wasn't in the cards. So this is kind of what after the convicts were freed and the main streets of the town of Saint Laurent. So I hope these pictures give you a sense of a glimpse of what life was really like there. We are actually visiting Ile Royale. We're not visiting Devil's Island. You will see it there. There's nothing on Devil's Island, no way to really get there unless you have a tiny boat. There is a little backpacker inn out there, but that's really it. It's pretty much off limits to everybody. But you'll get the definite feel of what it was like. Devil's Island was very few prisoners, maybe 4 or 5 at a time, max, and only the most violent and political prisoners were going to be there. So this is not scenic cruising. I know somehow something got out early on that we were going to do scenic cruising there. That was a mistake. But weather permitting, it'll be an actual stop where we tender ashore. Like I said, there's nothing there but a very interesting historical national park, which you can explore on your own. You got the map in the stateroom, and for the first hour and a half, I'll be at the dock and try and point you in the right direction. I'll give you some of the information that you need to know. The tender operation can be very tricky due to the currents. So we all need to think positively. This is one of those great off-the-beaten-path ports. But whether we can actually stop is really dependent on the weather and the way the ocean is at that time. Once you're ashore, it'll take 1.5 to 2 hours to really see everything on your own. It's a relatively small island, and it's pretty much impossible to get lost. And I promise you that we're not going to leave without anybody. We always, nobody manages to stay on Devil's Island. So the tender actually lands on Ile Royale. That little island in the back, that is Devil's Island itself. But there's, like I said, nothing there but a tiny, tiny little backpacker inn and the remains of a few stone cottages built by the inmates. Now, we want you to have a safe, happy time in prison. So, to do that, you want to wear comfortable shoes. It is going to be hot, humid, and tropical. You want to take along bottled water. You want to stay dehydrated. This area gets 150 inches of rain a year. Showers are likely. They're usually brief. But if you have a rain poncho, definitely take it. Take your time. Don't overdo it. And I'll talk in a minute about some of the hills you got to climb and some ways around that. But take your time, don't overdo it. And if you need first aid, there will be first aid personnel from the ship at the tender landing. Now, it is a steep, uneven uphill climb from the tender dock to the main area. Those rocks can be very slippery, especially if it rains. So if you have walking difficulties, you may just want to stay in the area around the tender dock. And there are some short trails, and I'll show you those in a minute, that you can still take, so get off the ship. I'll be there early on when we get in and kind of get you going in the right direction. But most of what you see, you want to hike up the hill to do that. When you walk off the dock and turn left, you're going to head up the hill. If you just keep walking straight, there's this nice, relatively level path that runs along. You can see Devil's Island over there, and it goes out to some of the ruins. Along with that is that little swimming area surrounded by big rocks to keep the sharks out. So the circle down here on the map is the tender dock, and then your map shows you, and I only had this map in French. Fortunately, they were able to translate it, and I see we have the list now in French, English, and German, and also to translate all the text was all in French, and now you lucky people, and thanks to the ship personnel here, it's now translated into English. So this will give you what you need to know. As you're hiking up the hill, about halfway up the hill, slightly to the right is a tiny little museum. Keep your eyes open. There are lots of animals around here. It's a protected national park. You'll see aguati, which are these tiny little rodent-like animals, sometimes called the Snickers of the forest. You know why? They're at the bottom of the food chain. Snickers of the rainforest. There's also a lot of monkeys, iguanas, some iridescent blue morpho butterflies. There's some toucans, macaws, parrots. It really is a fun place. Here's the welcoming committee up on the top. This is the chapel, and we talked about Francis Lagrange, who also painted the murals in the interior of this chapel. The paintings are in pretty bad shape, but usually you can just look through the iron gates to the front of the chapel. Usually it's not open, but unfortunately the paintings have been deteriorating. I was on Royal Princess, the old Royal Princess, the twin sister to this, and we were doing a run from Manaus to Fort Lauderdale for about 4 months, and so every 10 days we'd stop here. That's been a little while. I have not seen what the condition of the paintings are right now. There was a hospital on Ile Royale, various administrative buildings, and the cell blocks. You can actually walk through the cell blocks. You get some great pictures. If you ever wanted to get a picture of your husband for cheating on his income taxes, and this is the way to do it, the place to take the picture. But it really is it's very photographic, and you'll enjoy it. There's a tiny little hotel. You can get a drink. You can buy a few overpriced souvenirs. Inside, they actually have rum that in these bottles that's been soaked with various flavors to create different things. But there's not a lot there. There is a nice patio area off the hotel, which is really, I think, gives you the best view of the actual Devil's Island. And there's a lighthouse up there. Nearby are some ugly white cement buildings that don't look like much, but actually they are a tracking station, one of the best tracking stations actually, for the nearby European Space Center, which we'll talk about in a moment. If you walk beyond the lighthouse, you walk down a little slope, you'll come to the Children's Cemetery, which is used for children of the guards and prison administrators, their wives, their families, stuff like that. Adults were generally buried at sea, more than here in the prison. Most of these are children. I guess the image of putting your child in the sea to sharks was just too much. There are actually some pets that are buried here. But it's a very interesting thing. There were very few attempts there were constant attempts to escape, but very few people made it. Most were picked up and returned back. So this little circle is the dock, and you're going to want to, if you want to get up to the top, you're going to follow. There's a trail that goes up here. This is going uphill, and then eventually we'll come out to this. This is the main area of the remains of the prison. The hotel is here. This area here, there's a deep, it's dug out. And it was actually a giant cistern where they collected water to support all this. If you don't want to deal with the hill and stuff, you can still, this is that level path that goes around this way and goes up here. There's some nice areas, nice views. You're right along the water, the coast. And there's a few ruins and remains there. There actually is a couple ways to hike up the hill here, but if you're taking that path, you're not going to, it's just easier to come back and go up this way. When you finish and you're ready to come back to the ship, if you walk over past the lighthouse, down here to the cemetery, and you walk through the cemetery, behind the cemetery, you'll see a little dirt road. If you take that dirt road and turn to the left, that will eventually run along the cliff and bring you right back down here to the tender place. It's kind of a nice walk. And what's the interesting part about this is where all the monkeys hang out. This is where the tribe of monkeys hang out. There's a dumpster out there, and that's why the monkeys all like to hang out there. But you get some great monkey pictures if you want to do that. It's a pretty walk back to the ship. So you walk through the cemetery, turn left, walk down the road. You'll likely see the monkeys that hang out in this area, and it's really a nice walk because you get a chance to see and photograph the monkeys. And eventually it's going to lead back down to the tenders and back to the ship. Now, what you don't expect to find here is a space center, but the Guiana Space Center is the European Space Agency's launching pad. Now, why is it located here? Anybody know? Close to the equator. Why is that important? It's easier. The Earth is spinning faster there. It's like the old, dancers at Radio City Music Hall. The guy on the outside has to go faster. Okay, so that's why they want to be here. It's an ideal place to launch, and there've been a number of European space things have been launched here, as well as Russian satellites put up here, and that's all on the mainland. The location chosen because of the Earth's rotation velocity of about 500 meters per second, or 1,100 miles per hour, or 1,800 kilometers per hour near the equator. So when you're launching eastward, the Earth's rotation acts like a slingshot, helping to put the missile up into space. So the Guiana Space Center is a major employer. It's right on the coast. There have been times when on a clear day you can actually see a rocket on the launching pad from where we're docked when we're leaving, coming in. The ugly white buildings near the lighthouse that I mentioned are actually one of the world's most modern and sophisticated tracking centers. So here's a map of what's going on in the Space Center. It's kind of like a Cape Canaveral. I mean, it's got these launch pads, and then out here is the island and the tracking center. So I know you're going to have a fantastic time, and don't be tempted just to stay on the ship. Get off, even if you just walk around the tender port area a little bit. It's a fascinating story and a fascinating place to visit. Now, the one other thing I need to talk to you about this morning, because you've been such a good audience, I have something extra special for you, and that is a little talk about crossing the line. Now, the equator is an imaginary line on the Earth's surface. I've had people on ships say, well, when are we crossing the equator? Well, is it going to be marked? Oh, yeah, there's a big sign out there. Big sign says, this is the equator. Okay. No, it's an imaginary line on the Earth's surface approximately equidistant from north and south poles, dividing the northern and southern hemisphere. The equator is where the Earth is widest, and the equator is 24... Well, you can see the number there. I'm not going to try and read that. I hate reading numbers. And then I got to do it in both languages, regular and metric. But the sun is directly overhead of the equator on the two equinoxes near March and September. The tropics are the two lines, again imaginary lines, where the sun is directly overhead at noon on the two solstices near June and December 21st, marking the change of the seasons. And the area bounded by the tropics is known as the tropics. The tropics do not experience seasons or variation in climate because the sun is always high in the sky. I sometimes have read and responded to stuff on a thing online called Cruise Critic. And people are always asking, well, when is the best time to go through the canal when it's not so hot and humid? Well, we're 9 degrees off the equator, guys. It's always hot and humid. That's what the tropics are all about. And that's why, people like to come down here when it's nice and warm. So that's the reason why the tropics have, to me at least, very delightful temperatures. Now, latitude, which is represented by the Greek letter phi, gives the location north and south of the equator. It's an angular measurement in degrees from 0 degrees at the equator to 90 degrees at the poles, approximately the angle between straight up at the surface or the zenith and the sun at an equinox. Historically, mariners calculated latitude in the northern hemisphere by sighting the North Star with a sextant. Hipparchus was a Greek astronomer, geographer and mathematician. He was one of the greatest astronomers of antiquity, and he developed a quantitative and an accurate model for the motion of the sun and the moon. He was the first to suggest the use of grid lines, latitude and longitude. Eratosthenes was a later Greek mathematician and astronomer. He measured the circumference of the Earth, the equator, accurate to within 300 miles. But the Greeks could find latitude quite easily, measuring the sun's angle at noon relative to the equator. Accurately determining longitude would prove harder. It was possible to be off by 30 or 300 miles. So that's a big difference if you're trying to find something and you're off by 300 miles. Parliament offered a £4.5 million award to anyone who could come up with the way to determine longitude. And it was John Harrison, a self-educated English clockmaker, who invented the marine chronometer in 1730, which was basically a clock which could work reliably at sea, not using the traditional pendulum. Knowing time while making an altitude adjust measurement to the sun provided the critical data for the ship's position east to west. Now, this is why we have that marvelous old maritime tradition of the voice from the bridge, which the ship's position was determined at noon when the sun was at its zenith, and it was entered into the ship's log. As communication developed, then that position was reported to the home office. Today it's reported to you, not as originally by a megaphone, but by the officer of the watch from the bridge. And because of satellite technology and stuff, you can go to certain websites and you can see exactly where we were located. Any ship in the world, you can find exactly where it's located. But in the olden days, it was done like this. Poseidon was the Greek god of the sea. He's known as the earth shaker because he was also the god of earthquakes. In Roman mythology, he became Neptune. And when angered, he struck the ground with his trident, resulting in storms, earthquakes, drownings, and shipwrecks. Very, very important guy. Naturally, he needs to be appeased by sailors who would pray to Neptune for smooth seas and safe voyages. No one would want to anger King Neptune, except ignorant and inexperienced pollywogs. And therein lies the problem. Because there are masses of ignorant, inexperienced, uneducated pollywogs who dare to cross the equator for the first time, thus offending King Neptune. So mariners developed the tradition of crossing the line, where the uninitiated pollywogs are called before King Neptune and subjected to a variety of hazings. In the 19th century, some of these initiations were violent. Now, with hazing forbidden, it's a little more tame. So, knowing that you would want to know and need to know, I've asked around. I asked the captain, what happens when we cross the equator? And his response was, no one knows until crossing day when King Neptune comes forth from the deep. So I asked Homeland Security, who knows everything. And their response was the Department of Homeland Security does not permit us to comment. So I asked Prince's Home Office, and they replied, Princess only does what is in the best interest of our guest. A statement from the captain will be forthcoming. So I asked Adam, our cruise director, and he said, we can tell you, but then we will have to kill you. So we don't know. But I can tell you that on Princess, this is taken very seriously. And on Princess, your safety and enjoyment are our primary concern. So in any unforeseen event of any emergency, our medical team are standing by to assist you. So you understand the terminology and hierarchy. Polywogs. Do we have any polywogs or wogs here? Oh, come on, you can confess. Who've never crossed the equator? Oh. Wow. Good luck, guys. A shellback is someone who has crossed the equator. Let me see all my shellbacks. Yeah, the whole damn ship. Yeah, that's good. Okay, a golden shellback. Now we're getting really up into the exalted category. A golden shellback is someone who has crossed the equator at the international date line. Do we have golden? Look at that. We are in awe of you people. God. And the highest exalted is the emerald shellback or royal diamond shellback who has crossed the equator at the prime meridian at 0 degrees east and 0 degrees west. Do we have anyone who is an emerald shellback? That's even more prestigious than having a black card, folks. Do we have anybody? Who? Where? Stand up. No thanks. I mean, this gentleman, give him a round of applause. That's really outstanding. So, understand that all of this will be in good, clean fun, and you don't have to worry about it. You will have a wonderful time, and we'll all have a good laugh, and it should be a great time. So, folks, thanks a lot. Coming up, I think really what we're going to try and do is tomorrow, or tomorrow morning, I think, this is not certain yet, but I talked to Adam about it. I think we're going to try and do it. I'm going to talk about, because the elephant in the room as we go to Brazil is what? The Amazon, right? And we're going to be sailing right by the entrance to the Amazon, out at sea, of course, but we'll talk a little bit about Amazonia, I think, tomorrow, and then coming up on the next sea day, Brazil, Natal, Ilhabela, and Santos. I would suggest, if you have not been to Ilhabela, if you don't have, Ilhabela is famous for mosquitoes and bugs. So please, I checked. If you didn't bring along any bug spray, I'd rush right now to the stores and buy the limited supply that they have. Unfortunately, typical Princess fashion, we have about 6 or 8 bottles. We've got lots of rum. Maybe you can take that ashore and splash that on you. I don't know. But anyhow, have a great day, and I'll be going down to my desk. If you have questions about Devil's Island, again, I'll be out on the island when we first get there. So thanks, guys. Have a great day.
You're my reason.